After 15 years away, he drove back into the town as if he had stepped out of a photograph of another life. The black SUV rolled over packed dirt and raised a thin, familiar mist. Women paused on porches, a radio hissed in the distance, and a dog barked twice before folding himself under a porch step. It was not only the car that made people look up, it was the idea that a name that had disappeared from conversation might appear again in person. In his jacket pocket, there was a single folded note with one word in a handwriting he had not seen in a decade, a small tremor of a life he had left behind. The contrast was immediate. Cufflinks glinting beneath calloused hands, polished shoes scuffing mud, the scent of diesel and cologne colliding with the dry smell of sun-baked clay. He stepped out, and for a moment he was both the man whose face had been on a billboard and the boy who once ran barefoot through the same streets. What no one expected, and what he did not yet know, was that a single revelation waiting in the house at the end of the lane would rearrange every identity in that town. The gate creaked like it always had, thin metal protesting the weight of years. The porch boards sighed under his feet. Inside, the house held the rhythms of small places where time bends slowly. The kettle's soft whistle, a curtain trembling in a breeze that carried the scent of cinnamon and roasted coffee, the quiet clack of a radio playing old ballads. Rosa Morales appeared from the kitchen wiping her hands on a dish towel, hair pinned back in the same practical knot, face lined by sun and worry. She had been the keeper of many things in that town, and now she stood in the doorway seeing him for the first time in 15 years. He felt the world tilt as their eyes met. "Ethan," she said, voice a mix of recognition and reproach. He held out the folded note as if it were an offering and watched her mouth form the name that had sent this note into his pocket when he left town all those years ago. A photograph sat on the mantel, a yellowed corner revealing a child's laugh caught in frozen film, and the sight of it tightened something in his chest that had ached for a long time. Somewhere beyond the house, church bells marked the hour. Children kicked cans on the square, and the thin smell of frying dough drifted like a promise. He had come looking for forgiveness, answers, and perhaps a way to repair a life he had spent rebuilding far away. What he found at first was more complicated than any apology. The girl who opened the bedroom door later that afternoon was not the child in the photograph, but the resemblance hit him with a physical force. She stood without flinching, under the same dim light where a fan turned slowly, and the angle of her jaw, the slope of her nose, the way she tucked a stray curl behind an ear matched him in ways that made his breath hitch. "You must be Ethan," she said curtly, then softened when he flinched at the cadence of her voice. She carried a stack of notebooks and a small wrapped sandwich, and the faint smell of tomato and strong tea clung to her hands. Her name was Sophia Morales. Her presence rearranged years like the turning of a book page. They spoke in halting sentences at first, each phrase a test, voices lowered as if not to wake memories. He reached, awkwardly, for what felt like a straightforward truth, and found instead a tangle of omissions, half-truths, and a letter that Rosa had kept folded in a tin box. The letter's worn edges, the ink faded where hands had held it too long, became a relic and a weapon at once. Outside, a wind lifted dust into small spinning storms. A child called for his mother, and the distant rumble of a truck on the main road provided a steady human backdrop to what was quickly becoming the most consequential conversation of their lives. They sat at the kitchen table beneath a bare bulb. The table smelled faintly of lemon oil, the wood softened by years of hands. The first half hour was awkward, words stumbling over one another, bitter and sweet at once. "You could have written," Sophia said finally, fingers tracing the edge of a coffee cup, voice low. "I did," he answered. "There are letters," Rosa interrupted, clutching a folded envelope like a rosary. He placed the one in his pocket on the table. It was a small paper, edges worn, a name inked in a way that suggested trembling, and a brief line that read simply, "I am leaving, so I do not hurt you." For a moment, they listened to each other's breathing, counting the spaces between apologies. There was a photograph of a younger Rosa with his arm around her shoulder pinned to the wall, the texture of its glossy surface catching light, the must of old perfume rising from it. The conversation slid from the present to the past with the gravity of a confession. In it, a story of choices made under pressure, of a man who climbed and a woman who stayed, of promises that broke like thin glass. It was not a neat narrative. It was a living thing, messy and raw, smelling of sweat and coffee and the salty residue of too many tears. As night fell, they walked to the small chapel by the plaza, its bell a voice that stitched the town together. The darkness smelled of wet earth and citrus peels left on the windowsills. Inside, the light pooled in amber on worn benches. Candles flickered with a quiet desperation. Rosa sat back like someone who had carried a secret through too many seasons. "I kept the letters," she confessed, looking at him as if he were a man she had known intimately and also not at all. "I thought it would keep you away. I thought it would spare her." Her hands trembled when she spoke, fingers leaving smears of flour on the hem of her apron, an old habit of nervousness. A confession in a night like that is heavy. It settled in the room between them like dust. He thought of the careers built on other people's sacrifices, of boardrooms and banquet halls where he had learned to count dollars rather than days, and he realized with a strange clarity that the ledger of his life was missing a column. The chapel clock tolled. Outside, dogs howled briefly, a radio played a hymn, and a neighbor walked past whistling a tuneless tune. The weight of 15 years expanded until it filled the small spaces of the night and contracted again into something sharp and precise. The fact that someone had been denied the chance to know him. They spoke long into the night, and the night offered details that became part of the story itself. The dry crunch of peanut shells on the steps, the metallic tang of a battery-powered radio, the taste of stale sugar from a pocket of a coat he had not worn in years. Dialogue wove through memory and accusation. "Why would you take it?" he asked. "Why would you hide what was hers?" Rosa's face folded with an expression of exhausted protection. "Because I thought it would be kinder," she said. "Because I believed a lie that was easier to hold." She told them how, when the baby had been born, the town had whispered, and the men who had been his friends had advised silence. How a rumor had been easier to spread than an apology. The details came, names attached to them. Mayor Helen Cruz, who had allegedly offered to help. Pastor Miguel, who had counseled. Joaquim Alvarez, who had had reasons to silence the past. Carla Mendez, who had run market gossip like a ledger. Tomas Rivera, who fixed the trucks and listened to everything in the garage. Ava Martinez from the regional paper, who had written a story that framed his departure as a disgrace. And Luis Ortega, who had been a cousin with a temper. Each name landed with a small sound. A cup set down, a branch scratching a window. The town's chorus expanded until it felt like the whole place had been a character in the drama, and the question multiplied. Who had benefited from the silence, and who had paid for it? The next morning, the discovery that the girl in the photograph was indeed his daughter became more than a possibility. It became a fact with fingerprints of evidence. They compared birthmarks, the length of fingers, the family lilt in spoken vows. They spoke aloud, each trying to map how. 15 years had redirected so many lives. He reached for his phone, feeling ridiculous holding a glowing rectangle in the shade of a veranda while a rooster crowed nearby. "We should do a test," Sophia said, steady for the first time in hours. "We should know." He hesitated. His life had been about certainties, but this was not a balance sheet. It was a heartbeat. Rosa handed him a small tin containing the old letters. The paper crackled in his hands, and the smell of old ink rose like a memory. There is more than one way secrets move, Rosa whispered, and the room seemed to tilt around the idea that some truths need instruments to appear. Outside, someone was sweeping leaves with a broom, the sound like a metronome, the town continuing its patient rotations. The idea that a DNA test, a single procedure, could dismantle or confirm years of living carried with it a heavy, almost clinical anxiety. They went to the clinic in the next town, a modest place smelling of antiseptic and boiled linen, where a nurse with kind eyes named Elena guided them through the paperwork. The process itself would be simple, she explained. Cheek swabs, a chain of custody forms signed, samples sealed in tamper-evident collection bags, and then shipped to a laboratory in the city with a courier chain logged at every handoff. The lab would extract DNA, amplify specific markers, run a comparative analysis to determine paternity likelihood, and produce a report within 10 working days. The nurse described probabilities and controls, a ballet of scientific steps designed to remove doubt, and as she spoke, the clinical language made the stakes feel both smaller and more precise. The official form had a small brown stamp that smudged slightly when he signed his name, a tactile reminder that bureaucracy loves the smell of ink and the scrape of a pen. The medical assistant pressed the swabs to the inside of cheeks that had tasted coffee and sugar and fear, and the motion was mechanical, tender, and strange. It was one of those technical moments that lends credibility and finality to a story. The documentation, the seals, the courier manifest, the lab accession number. It felt, paradoxically, like both a ritual and a release. At around 30% into the time since they first met, when the DNA was on its way and the town had already begun to divide into whispering camps, the story needed a place for viewers to step in. If you are feeling shock or compassion now, know that you are not alone. These kinds of discoveries stir everything we carry inside: anger, grief, relief, confusion. Did you ever learn a family secret that changed how you saw someone? Tell it in one line below, starting with "I learned" or "I found out," so others reading can feel less alone. Start your comment with "I understand" if you relate, or "I do not know" if you disagree. Your voice helps. Others feel seen and feeds the conversation that allows communities to process pain together. Share kindly, and if you want updates about what happens next in this family, follow this story as it unfolds. Now, back to the house, where the waiting is like a tangible thing, a silence made of possibilities. The report arrived with sterile efficiency. The envelope bore the lab logo and a barcode that Rosa traced with a finger as if it were a map. They opened it at the kitchen table with hands that betrayed their steadiness. The result said one thing clearly: probability greater than 99.9%. The paper smelled faintly of chlorine from the office where it had been printed. For a second, there was no sound, except for the hum of a distant refrigerator and the faint clack of a television in a neighbor's home. Then the room erupted. Laughter that broke into sobs, tears that left salt on the knuckles, hands searching for one another across the table like magnets. He took Sophia's hands and felt the small canyons of calluses, the heat of her palms like the solid fact of another human. "I am your father," he said, the words small and huge at once. She let out a breath that had been held since the photograph. Rosa smiled in a way that emptied years out of her face, as if relief could iron out the lines that grief had made. Yet, even as the immediate truth settled, other questions grew louder. Who had hidden this fact, and why had it been kept from those who had a right to know? The news did not stay private for long. Radio reports drifted in through open windows. An article by Ava Martinez appeared the next day, with a headline that framed him as a returning millionaire and a man whose secrets had been buried. The square filled as if by invitation. Neighbors came with expressions that ranged from curious to accuser, carrying dishes, gossip, and old grievances like offerings. Mayor Helen Cruz arrived with perfunctory concern, smiling for a camera phone someone had produced, as if a municipal endorsement could soothe the ruptures of a family. Pastor Miguel crossed himself and offered a few measured words about reconciliation that sounded rehearsed against the wetness of his eyes. Joaquin Alvarez, a man known for his influence and thin smile, lingered at the back of the crowd, his posture a question. Carla Mendez brought a casserole and a plate of hard biscuits, setting them down with practical hands. Tomas Rivera stood nearby, with oil on his palms, as if his work had taught him how to fix things. Luis Ortega whispered about loyalties and debts, and Ava and another reporter named Daniel Moreno took notes, pen scratching like the sound of reweaving a torn fabric. The town had been tugged into visibility and now had to decide how to respond to a truth that implicated many. Tension thickened as accusations began to orbit one another. An impromptu meeting formed in the square with people speaking over one another, voices rising and falling in waves. "You left us to rot," one woman shouted. "You walked away," another added. Ethan tried to address them, palms open, voice steady though his stomach felt like a stone. "I never meant to abandon," he said. "I made choices that I thought were right, but I am here now to make amends." The words had the directness of a businessman used to public relations, but between them lay years of broken nights and small indignities. A missed birthday, a school play he had not known about, a graduation photo he would never consult. "Answers," Rosa insisted, turning to face the crowd as if she were bracing to wear the town's judgment. "We have answers now, but we need more than words." Joaquim stepped forward, his voice smooth like a river that hides rocks. "We need accountability," he said. "We need to know what promises were broken and if anyone profited from them." Someone accused him of having profited indirectly from a rumor that had pushed Ethan away. Another insisted that rumors had been protective. The murmurs rose like heat over asphalt. The moment was dense with eyes, with townspeople listing offenses and grievances as if they were tally marks on a ledger. The funeral that followed a few days later for an elderly neighbor who had been like a second mother to many became the stage for a public confrontation. The smell of lilies and wax filled the small chapel, the air heavy with the scent of mourning and stewed beans from a pan moved by hands that tried to make ordinary comfort feel like balm. The coffin sat open for a while, a fragile thing, and people filed past, each leaving a whisper. In a corner, someone tapped out a message on a phone. The congregation included Mayor Helen Cruz, Pastor Miguel, Joaquim Alvarez, Carla Mendez, Tomas Rivera, Ava Martinez, Luis Ortega, and others. Emotions cranked high when Luis stepped to the lectern and spoke of belonging and betrayal, of the fine line between protection and theft when it came to family secrets. "We guard what we love," he said, voice shaking. "But sometimes guarding becomes a cage." Joaquim whispered something to Mayor Helen, a detail that would be repeated later, a name suggested in private, a reason for silence. Ava took notes like a scribe. The pen was relentless. The funeral became not only a goodbye to one life, but a trial of many. In the weeks that followed, a confrontation at Joaquim Alvarez's house crystallized some of the deeper motives. The house smelled of pipe smoke and lemon oil. Joaquim answered the door with an expression that tried to be casual and failed. Inside, the air seemed to contract. "You knew what you were doing," Ethan said, each word a small hammer. Joaquim poured coffee, the bitter steam rising between them. "And you think I profited?" Joaquin asked, shrugging as if the weight of intent could be shrugged off. "There were deals to be protected," Joaquin said, voice taut. "There were reputations to preserve. In our town, one scandal ruins many lives." The dialogue lengthened into a series of exchanges that were pointed and precise. "Did you ever think about the child?" Ethan demanded. "Did you think about what silence would do?" Sometimes honesty breaks more things than it fixes, Joachim replied. Sometimes we choose the lesser evil. The air tasted of metal and coffee and old money. A glass of water sweated on the table like a small, polite witness. Their voices rose and fell with the cadence of accusation and defense, and outside, a rain began to patter on the tin roof, each drop a percussion to the exchange. It felt like a showdown that could have been a courtroom scene, except that what they adjudicated would be moral rather than legal for most of the townsfolk. There were procedural steps that brought a formal feel to the unraveling of years. The handwriting analysis added another technical layer. An independent document examiner compared the fold lines, ink, pressure, and letter shapes from the old letters with other samples attributed to people in town. The expert noted characteristic loops and slants, a pressure difference consistent with someone writing under duress, and a partial match that did not fully exonerate any single person. The chain of custody for the test was recorded in a ledger, sealed with initials, scanned and archived. Each procedural report was 300 words of precise description that gave the narrative weight. Samples were collected under supervision, sealed, logged, and analyzed using standardized methodology to ensure objective results. The formality of these documents made the personal feel public, and when they were read aloud in a small town hall meeting, the rustle of paper sounded like finality, even when all questions had not yet been answered. Tension reached a new peak when Joachim was accused openly in the square, and he replied with a counter-accusation that implicated someone else. Voices rose into shouts. "You ruined a life for control," Sophia said, hands clenched, voice shaking but loud enough to be heard above the rest. "We thought you were helping," Carla said, defensive. "You thought you were saving the town," Ava said, pen poised like a scalpel. The confrontation stretched in breaths and phrases. For 2 long paragraphs, the argument volleyed with sharpness, each retort landing with the weight of years. People cried out about pride, about reputations kept pristine at the cost of truth, about how rumors can be weaponized. The scene was a pressure cooker that hissed until someone opened a window. An elderly woman, Mrs. Rivera, stood and spoke with a voice like gravel about the cost of secrecy. Her testimony was brief and precise and lands the hard truth that a life of silence can be crueler than the truth itself. The town watched and listened and formed new judgments. Amid the fury, a deathbed confession changed the tone. Rosa's sister, Maria Elena, who had been frail and kept out of the more public squabbles, called Rosa in the middle of the night and said she could not keep something to herself any longer. She arrived at the house with a slow gait, breathing like she had climbed a hill. The room smelled of medicinal ointment and lavender. She sat by Rosa's bedside and, with a voice barely above a whisper, told the truth. She had intercepted letters, thrown some away, and lied to keep others from causing harm as she saw it. "I thought I was protecting," she said, palms up, the motion like a benediction and an absolution. Her confession stretched across 2 paragraphs with the intimacy of someone unburdening an old wound, the cadence of memory that made the room seem smaller and more honest. The details were precise and painful. She remembered the exact night she burned one envelope, the way the flame curled ink into the air like a small, private sacrament. Her admission shifted the moral calculus for many. While it did not erase the damage of what had been withheld, it allowed for a new beginning in which culpability could be distributed rather than concentrated. The confession was an emotional earthquake that unmoored old anchors. A plan for repair emerged as they argued and mourned and spoke late into nights. Ethan proposed a cooperative model, a practical structure that could turn the scandal into something that repaired social fabric and produced income. He spoke of converting a disused warehouse on the outskirts into a workshop where people could make goods, textiles, furniture, preserves, and sell them beyond the town. "We will call it the Harbor Cooperative," he said, fingers steepled as he laid out spreadsheets and small, realistic projections. "It will be owned by its members, profits shared, training provided." Sophia, practical and inventive, sketched a layout on recycled paper. Sewing stations, a small kitchen for preserves, room for local artisans. They consulted people like Tomas Rivera for logistics and construction, Carla Mendez to coordinate local markets and produce shipments, Eva Martinez to help with publicity, and Luis Ortega to handle deliveries and security. The idea smelled of wood shavings and soap boiling in a pot, and the town liked the tang of possibility. The plan included simple bylaws, a transparent accounting system, and training workshops. They set up a modest meeting that would become the first official step in rebuilding trust. Signatures on a charter, agreed upon distribution of earnings, and a promise to hire fairly. Implementation began in a borrowed galpon behind an old mechanic's shop. The galpon smelled of oil and sawdust and new paint. Sunlight slanted through slatted windows, and dust motes danced in the air like a congregation. They cleared out broken machines and found bench space, hung lamps that hummed with a low, comforting sound, and set up tables. The first day the cooperative opened, there was a nervous energy that tasted like strong coffee and anticipation. Sophia set up a workstation and taught two young women how to use a sewing machine, the metallic click and whir, a new music in the town. Tomas repaired a broken lathe, and in the corner someone boiled sugar for preserves, the kitchen filling with the scent of citrus and cinnamon. Names mattered now. Maria Elena came to offer mending. Rosa took responsibility for inventory. Mayor Helen came with an envelope of a small municipal grant. Pastor Miguel lent the cooperative a crate of blankets to be remade and sold. Joaquim, after much deliberation and with the town watching, handed over a check for an initial operating cost as a symbolic gesture and perhaps a way to redeem his public standing. The process was slow and awkward at first, but each afternoon closed with new products stacked on shelves. Hands that had not worked together, now learning rhythms of shared labor and a kind of camaraderie that comes from making things with your hands. The days that followed were small victories stitched together. A local radio segment with Ava drew interest from a regional buyer who wrote a modest check. Orders began to arrive, a batch of aprons for a cafe in the next town, a series of wooden toys for a children's store, a pallet of jams. The first sale was a moment of champagne and tears. The taste of sugar was literal and metaphorical. People who had once turned away now came seeking work and reconciliation. The cooperative meetings were noisy and long, full of negotiations about hours, pay, and responsibilities. "We will distribute profits monthly," Sophia insisted. "We will also set aside a small fund for training." Luis argued for security measures. Tomas argued for more time to fix the tools. They hammered out rules and learned to argue without burning bridges. The practical work of building a business became therapy of sorts for a town learning to rebuild trust. As weeks passed, production improved, discipline formed, and the cooperative began to pay living wages to at least a handful of members. One evening, as the cooperative door closed and the lamps were turned off, Joaquim came by alone. He stood outside long enough to watch the place become a dark silhouette, then knocked softly. The air tasted of rain and metal. He asked to come in, his voice small. "I did wrong," he said plainly. "I thought I was saving the town from scandal, but I tried to control too much." He offered a public apology and spoke of misjudgments like a list of small crimes. The moment felt like a turning point. It was not full redemption, but it was a mature step toward accountability. Sophia listened, her jaw set, tears cutting clean tracks on her cheeks. She accepted his apology with reservation because forgiveness was not a handshake but a slow process.
The town watched and judged, and some accepted, some remained skeptical. But the
act of asking for forgiveness began a chain of small changes. Several moments of tension returned as the legal shade of the affair lingered. There were threats of litigation from a distant relative who believed the family had been defrauded, a television crew that wanted sensational footage, and a heated council meeting where some townspeople demanded criminal charges. Each of these crises played out across 2 paragraphs of rising stakes, discussion, and eventual cooling by sensible voices. The legal arguments were methodical and dry, in contrast to the emotional torrents. Counsel explained statutes, limitations, and the practical difficulty of proving intentional harm across many years. The media circus attempted to frame a human story into a headline, but the cooperative steady progress and measured responses quelled much of the sensationalism. Slowly, the town's channels of gossip lost velocity and were replaced by practical problem-solving. Backstories were told in careful bursts across nights when the cooperative light stayed on late and people lingered. Ethan's backstory emerged in 3 precise paragraphs that traced a boy raised on modest means, a scholarship that took him to the city, his early idealism, the choices that led to a business empire, and the loneliness of success. He had been a son who left to create safety and found only more hunger. He had been a young man who promised to return and did not. The narrative of his rise was filled with the clink of elevator doors, the smell of cigar smoke at celebratory dinners, and the cold surfaces of boardroom tables. As a child, he had run barefoot across fields, learned to fix a generator by watching Tomas, and had fallen in love with the daughter of a woman who baked bread for the market. He had left at 22 with a suitcase and a vow that translated into ambition and then silence. The middle paragraphs described his years away: hard nights, high rises, the taste of expensive coffee in sleek cups while hollowness gnawed at him, the slow accumulation of awards, and the emptiness that success sometimes confers. The last paragraph of his backstory described the ache that brought him back: a photograph mailed in an envelope with a single line, a name written in a hand he had loved, and the sudden realization that his ledger had been missing a most essential column. Sophia's backstory unfolded in a similar structure of 3 paragraphs. Born to a woman who worked 2 jobs and a town that had quickly made itself into a guardian and a jailer, she had learned to be self-sufficient early. She learned to patch roofs with Tomas, to bargain in the market with Carla, to listen to the radio and imagine a future that extended beyond the square. School had been a place of small rebellions and stubborn curiosity. She learned to fix a sewing machine out of necessity when money ran low, and to compose notes by the light of a kerosene lamp. In the middle part of her story, adolescence forged a certain independence, friendships hardened and softened, and music and notebooks became her companions. The last part described her encounter with the photograph that made a father a possibility, the bitter mix of hope and suspicion that followed, and the decision to demand truth that led to a DNA test and the reshaping of a life. Each paragraph of her backstory kept to the rhythm of memory and sensory detail: the smell of seam oil, the roughness of certain benches, the way sunlight fell on a knitted blanket in winter. 3 distinct moments of tension were expanded in dedicated passages. The first was the public confrontation at the square, where accusations flew and reputations frayed. It was rendered across 2 paragraphs with the tight focus of a pressure cooker, words sharp, and the town split in judgment. The second was the day the lab report came back, and the 1,000 small practical consequences cascaded, each described in a paragraph that captured the rawness of relief and fear in equal measure. The third was the deathbed confession of Maria Elena, which landed in the narrative like a meteor, breaking old orbits and forcing new reckonings. It was sketched in 2 paragraphs that held both the intimacy of whispered admissions and the public consequences that followed. Legally, the family pursued a modest civil inquiry to document acts of concealment and to clarify whether any financial or legal rights had been interfered with. The procedure included notarized statements, affidavits taken in a municipal office, and an auditor reviewing historical records for property and benefit transfers.
This bureaucratic measure was explained in 300 words of clear procedural detail that emphasized chain of custody, sworn testimonies, and the auditor's role in tracing any monetary implications. The point was to establish a public record and to decide whether there were actionable harms. The audit found no large-scale theft, but documented miscommunications and improper handling of documents that could have legal effect. The result prompted reparative measures rather than prosecutions in most cases, a decision that favored restoration over punishment. As the cooperative gained traction, reconciliation continued, slow and uneven. Some members of the community stayed distant, others threw themselves into the work. Mayor Helen publicly praised the cooperative in a radio interview, though some suspected political motives. Pastor Miguel offered counseling sessions for families, and a local school started a program teaching textile crafts to young people. Ava and Daniel Moreno published follow-up pieces that were cautiously sympathetic, noting the economic progress and the emotional repair, but also keeping a critical eye on power dynamics that had allowed secrets to persist. The cooperative began to sponsor a scholarship for youth who wanted to study trades. Small, measurable impacts appeared. 5 new members found regular work, monthly earnings rose for participating families, and local markets reported increased sales. The town's sense of purpose shifted from gossip to production, and that shift felt like progress. 1 month later, the immediate shock had softened.
But not disappeared. The cooperative had produced its first real income and paid its members modest wages. Sophia had begun teaching a weekly class for teenagers who wanted to learn sewing and design. Ethan hosted a community meeting where he outlined a commitment to fund a maintenance fund for the cooperative for the next year. Mrs. Rivera had organized a small memorial garden in the square to honor those who had been lost to years of silence. The town reported a minor increase in local commerce and an uptick in civic pride that could be measured in the number of people working and the volume of goods leaving the galpon. Socially, pockets of resentment lingered. A few families refused to engage with those who had been implicated in concealing letters. The public conversation moved toward restitution and education rather than punishment. The cooperative's books were open and reviewed at a town hall meeting, and the transparency helped stabilize trust. Notes in the local paper expressed a guarded optimism that the economy and the civic life had begun to mend. 3 months later, the cooperative had a stable roster of artisans and a steady stream of small orders that allowed them to hire a bookkeeper. The town school reported that involvement in vocational training had reduced absenteeism among older students. Ethan had started mentoring a few young entrepreneurs, offering practical advice and small grants for viable projects. Joaquim had volunteered to fund a community literacy project after months of cautious reintegration. Maria Elena had publicly apologized at a community gathering and led a small workshop on letter writing and the ethics of secrecy that drew a crowd. The council voted to allocate a permanent small annual grant to support community-led economic projects. A small documentary piece by Ava aired on regional television, presenting the town's transformation as a cautionary tale and a blueprint. The cooperative's financial reports showed improved margins and a modest reserve fund, indicating not only survival but early signs of sustainability. Emotionally, people spoke openly at meetings, and although forgiveness was still uneven, everyday interactions were less tense. 6 months later, the cooperative had outgrown its initial galpon and moved into a larger space, renovated through a mix of community labor and a matched grant from a regional development fund. They had contracted with a distributor in the city for monthly shipments. 5 families reported a reliable income that had allowed them to invest in education for their children and repair homes. The local school included a cooperative practicum in its curriculum. Sophia had launched a small online shop that reached customers beyond the region, and Ethan had formalized a trust to support apprenticeships. The town's annual festival featured stalls from the cooperative and an official ribbon cutting by Mayor Helen, who praised the new beginnings with a measured speech.
The memorial garden in the square had become a small place of remembrance visited often. The legal inquiry closed with recommendations for municipal archives to manage
personal documents more carefully and for civic education about the harms of secrecy. The overarching lesson had become visible. Truth, costly as it may be, has the potential to re-knit what lies broken and turn loss into a foundation for something that benefits many. In the quieter evenings now, the town seemed to breathe differently. People greeted one another with the tentative warmth of those who have seen each other at their worst and decided to try again. Sophia and Ethan met often, sometimes in meetings, sometimes just to repair a fence or walk past the square. They learned to tell a story that included the ache, the mistakes, and the labor of rebuilding. The cooperative continued to grow slowly, as these enterprises do, with the rhythms of orders and production, of mistakes and corrections, of laughter and argument. Maria Elena worked at the cooperative and sometimes sat with Rosa on the steps of the house where she had once kept so many letters. They would talk quietly about small things that make life sweeter, the way bread should be kneaded, the best time to pick tomatoes, the right ratio of sugar for a preserve. The town kept its memory, but also its hands busy. At the end, the lesson remained simple and profound. Truth had a price, but so did silence. The revelation that came with his return was a painful wrench that had required public airing, private admissions, and the slow labor of repair. They had turned a rupture into an opportunity by building something that offered livelihoods and a framework for transparency. If this story moved you, consider leaving a comment sharing an experience of truth and repair, or a small way your community has turned pain into possibility. If you want more stories about people who rebuild after secrets and betrayals, subscribe to follow updates. In the quiet after the storms, the town learned that forgiveness is not a single act, but a series of small, persistent decisions to keep showing up. That choice, more than any apology, became the true work of making a life worth living again.